I'm Nikki Rogers, a Principal Statistical Methodologist at the Office for National Statistics. I'm presenting submission number 24, Use of Statistical Modelling to Predict International Migration during 2020. This is a joint presentation with my colleague Louisa Blackwell. In this presentation, I'll describe our approach to model international migration to and from the UK last year, when we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Normally, we would use the International Passenger Survey to estimate international migration, but this survey was stood up during the pandemic, so we had to turn to alternative data sources and new methods to estimate how migration was affected by the pandemic. So today I'll start with some background on the International Passenger Survey and our ambition to move away from this and use admin data. This, of course, was accelerated by the pandemic. I'll go on to describe the challenges we faced estimating international migration last year, and I'll take you through some of the exploratory analysis we did to inform our models and underpinning assumptions. I'll go into a bit more detail on the multivariate state space models that we developed, present some results, and then finish up with thoughts for discussion and next steps. Of course, we welcome feedback on our methods and results. But first, I'd like to acknowledge others involved in this collaborative project. The modelling was led by ONS methodologists, and we worked with modelling and migration experts at the University of Southampton. We're indebted to colleagues at the Home Office for making data available to us and for their expertise and input. We sought expert assurance of our methods through the National Statisticians Methodological Assurance Review Panel, and we're grateful for their feedback. And we used the Delphi panel to gather expert opinion on our model assumptions and early estimates, and we're appreciative of their input too. ONS regularly produces a range of statistics on migration, including long-term and short-term migration, as well as characteristics of the migrant population. The long-term migration estimates feed into our annual mid-year population estimates, and it's these estimates that underpin many of our statistics and are used for policy, planning, and decision-making. Migration flows are based on evidence from the International Passenger Survey. So just a bit of background about the survey. It's been running since 1961 and interviews people entering and leaving the United Kingdom. Around 700 to 800 interviews are conducted in a year. Migrants are identified through their intentions to remain or stay away from the UK. And ONS has long acknowledged that the International Passenger Survey has been stretched beyond its original use and doesn't adequately capture the complexity of today's migration patterns. There's user demand for more in-depth information about migration and the experience of migrants living in the UK. So we've been exploring all available data sources, including admin data, to improve our international migration statistics. This programme of work started in 2017 and by necessity was accelerated last year due to COVID. So during this period, we developed a tactical modelling approach to estimate international migration in Q2. So that's April through to June, as we didn't have the International Passenger Survey. Independently of this, our colleagues in the ONS Centre for International Migration developed admin-based migration estimates, and they used two sources of data: Department for Work and Pensions rapid data, so that's the registration and population interaction database, which collects data on pay-as-you-earn, self-assessment, pensions and benefits, and also Home Office border data. But these estimates didn't cover the pandemic period as the UN definition was used for estimation. For those that aren't aware, the UN definition of a long-term international migrant is someone who changes their country of residence for 12 months or more. So we would need a longer time window of data to be able to say whether someone was a long-term migrant in the UK or if someone had departed from the UK long-term. This infographic usefully describes what exactly we're trying to measure in terms of international migration. The tree diagram is based on International Passenger Survey estimates for 2019. Without the IPS, from March 2020, we have evident gaps indicated here by the jigsaw pieces, especially for immigrating EU and British nationals. The Home Office data give better coverage for non-EU nationals through the immigration system, and historically non-EU nationals account for a larger share of total immigration. Going forward, data on EU immigration was started to be collected at the start of January 2021. For immigration, it's a much sparser picture, especially for British nationals, who historically accounted for around a third of all emigrants, according to the International Passenger Survey. So what would migration look like for Q2 if we just simply extended the International Passenger Survey time series? This chart shows total immigration. The solid blue line is the International Passenger Survey estimate, and we show uncertainty intervals. These are represented by the dotted blue line. You can see that immigration is highly seasonal, with peaks in September and October each year, when international students typically arrive to start their studies. The green dashed line is our estimate for March 2020 onwards with uncertainty intervals. But the question is, does this look plausible? And we did the same for emigration as well. The pandemic presented a number of challenges. As I said, our business as usual survey, the International Passenger Survey, was stood up in March last year. So we had to turn to alternative data sources. But these data present challenges in themselves. They're often not designed to measure migration, and they often have coverage issues. They can be less timely and have inherent time lags. We realised quickly it's not possible to reliably estimate international migration from past trends alone, because migration behaviours changed in response to border closures and travel restrictions, not just in the UK, but also in other countries. For example, those arriving as long-term migrants pre-pandemic may have departed early, or short-term migrants or visitors may have inadvertently become long-term migrants during the pandemic because they're unable to travel back home. This all required innovative use of data and modelling methods to produce estimates. And of course, added to this is Brexit. It's hard to disentangle the two in the data. We weren't alone. We met with other national statistical offices who were faced with the same challenge. The conclusion was that migration behaviours were unpredictable during this period and challenging to estimate. For our modelling, we used a variety of data sources. We've highlighted in green the sources that we use in our current models. Highlighted in blue are the data sources we use in our exploratory analysis, and this was to provide context and insight into the assumptions that we made for the models. And we've highlighted in red the data sources that we did look at, but we found them to be less timely, as they didn't cover the pandemic period. We explored Home Office data on air passenger arrivals, and in this chart, the black line indicates total air passenger arrivals during 2019. And then for 2020, the blue bars indicate air arrivals for British, and the orange bars arrivals for non-British. We can see that there's a cliff edge in March 2020 when passenger arrivals sharply decreased as the UK went into lockdown. And there were very few arrivals between April and June. But this tended to pick up in the summer as restrictions were eased and new travel corridors began to open. But the level of arrivals was not as previously seen. And likewise for air passenger departures, we saw reduced departures between April and June 2020, but with departures resuming in the summer months, but again, not at the same levels. We also looked at what happened with other modes of travel. Of course, travel by all modes to the UK declined sharply from March 2020. And in this chart, we are showing passenger inflows by mode as a proportion of all passenger inflows. Under a steady state, air passenger arrivals typically dominate, which you can see here with the blue. But from April onwards, the proportion that air travel accounted for decreased, but we saw a corresponding increase in the proportion of travel via ferries, that's the grey, and train, that's the orange, over this period. And likewise for passenger outflows. We also looked at visas granted. This chart shows visas granted for work, study, and family. And what it shows is a decrease in visas granted in Q2 2020. But it wasn't just travel plans that were disrupted by the pandemic. We also learnt that visa processing centres closed in March 2020. However, there was recovery later in the year as centres reopened, and we could see a recovery in the number of student visas granted. This chart shows nicely the impact of the pandemic on those arriving for work. We show month and year of visa granted on the vertical axis and month and year of first arrival with no subsequent departure on the horizontal axis. So pre-pandemic, in a steady state, you can see that most people travelled to the UK quite quickly after their visa was granted, and this is indicated by the blue shading. But as we move into the pandemic, if you go up towards the top right of the chart, fewer are arriving, and that's indicated by the lighter green shading. At the time, we didn't know if they would arrive later in 2020, but at the moment we're looking at later updates of these data, so we'll be able to see what happens later on in the year. Here we show departures of non-EU nationals using Home Office border crossing data. We see an increase in departures for all visa routes, highlighted by the blue line, during March 2020, and that was for visas due to expire before June 2020. You can see that departures fell during April and then started to increase from July. And if we look at departures for those on work visas, in normal times, visa holders typically depart at least 1 month before their visa expires. And this is indicated here with the lighter shading that shows a smaller proportion have yet to depart. And the darker blue shading shows that a higher proportion are still here and have yet to depart. So for those whose visas are due to expire in the future, you can see from the blue shading in the top left-hand side of the chart that many are still here. But if you move across to the right, from March 2020 onwards, we see that the pattern is disrupted as departures were brought forward. This may be temporary behaviour, as people may have chosen to return to families during the pandemic and perhaps return at a later date. Or it could be departures with no actual intention to return. But of course, time and further data updates will reveal if these were permanent departures. I should note here that this analysis excludes visa extensions. Turning to the modelling, we used multivariate state space models to estimate international migration. For those of you who would like more technical detail on the models, we published a paper in April, and I'll give a link at the end of this presentation. In this slide, I've summarised our modelling for international migration during Q2 2020 and a little bit beyond. We modelled immigration and emigration for British, EU and non-EU nationals from February 2020 onwards. And for net migration, we simply subtracted emigration from immigration. Our base model used International Passenger Survey seasonality and trends from 2010 to February 2020, shown by the red arrows. That's for the period from March onwards. We make adjustments to this model based on assumptions around behavioural change and travel opportunities to estimate migration for March 2020 onwards. And these behavioural change adjustments are based on Home Office border crossing data. These are observed arrivals, the green arrow, and observed departures, the purple arrows. For EU nationals, we made adjustments using ferry and train data, and we adjusted the non-EU exit checks or Home Office border crossing data for EU nationals using the proportion of ferry, Eurostar and tunnel to model travel opportunities for this group. You can see that without the International Passenger Survey, data for migration in early 2020 was very thin. As part of the model process, we drew on expert opinion to help us validate assumptions that we made in our models, and we ran 2 rounds of Delphi with experts. We had 3 assumptions underpinning our models, one for non-EU, EU and British nationals. For non-EU, our assumption was that flows for non-EU visa nationals in the Home Office data were a true representation of changed patterns of arrivals and departures for this group in Q2 2020. For EU nationals, we assumed that we could use non-EU exit checks data or Home Office border data as evidence of changed migration behaviour to model EU migration during Q2, and that we could modify this to reflect increased travel options for EU nationals. And for British nationals, we assumed that the behaviour of arriving British nationals was the same as that observed in the exit checks data for departing non-EU. And then we assumed that the behaviour of departing British nationals was the same as that observed in the exit checks data for arriving non-EU. Moving on to some results. So here I'm showing total immigration. The solid blue line are the International Passenger Survey estimates up to February 2020. And we also show uncertainty intervals using the dotted blue line. We modelled March 2020 onwards, and the reason we did this was that the International Passenger Survey only collected data in the first half of March, and we believed that these data were not representative of what actually happened throughout the whole month. So our modelled estimates suggest reduced immigration across all nationality groups during Q2 last year, and that's shown by the green solid line, and again we show uncertainty intervals. And turning to emigration, our modelled estimates show increased emigration in March 2020, reducing in April, but then increasing slowly. And turning to net migration, our model suggests that total net migration was negative from March 2020, as more people were leaving than arriving. If we look at cumulative net migration for the period year ending June 2020, so that's from July 2019 through to June 2020, and we use this time period for our mid-year population estimates, we can see that despite negative net migration between April and June 2020, net migration over the whole period was in fact higher than in 2018-19. And this was largely driven by increased immigration and fewer departures by non-EU nationals in the period prior to COVID. So to sum up, I've explained that migration estimates are a large component of population change, and they feed into the mid-year population estimates that ONS produces. The COVID pandemic has really highlighted an urgent need for timely population estimates. For example, they're crucial for vaccination planning, estimating infection rates, and estimating the population at risk. But our business as usual surveys and methods to produce migration estimates were severely impacted by the pandemic. From exploratory data analysis, we saw that migration and travel behaviours changed in response to travel, economic and other social policies that were introduced last year during the pandemic. Our traditional definitions of international migration imply a level of individual control over the decision to migrate and some predictability in those decisions. These may not have been realistic during 2020. This meant we had to turn to alternative data sources and use models to estimate what may have happened. Going forward, we are planning to model quarters 3 and 4, 2020 and beyond, but also to produce modelled estimates at a more granular level, for example, for different migrant streams such as work, study, family and other. Our estimates currently are at the UK level, and we're exploring methods to produce these at England and Wales level and lower. We learned that using models really underlines the importance of prediction during this unprecedented period and unpredictable period. Our models were built on assumptions based on empirical evidence that we gathered, but of course things are rapidly evolving, so our assumptions are likely to change, as will our modelled estimates as data mature or new data sources become available. So this demands provisional estimates that are subject to retrospective revision, and of course continued exploration of data as they become available and incorporate these into our models, particularly for British and EU nationals. And finally, for those of you who want to read more about this research, here's a link to our published paper. Thank you for listening.